Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy who? Jimmy who?
I don't know who he is.
When he announced his campaign for the presidency in 1974, Jimmy Carter was a virtual unknown. The peanut farmer and one-term governor from Georgia promised never to tell a lie to the American people.
As I've traveled and talked and listened and learned,
he inspired confidence and optimism in a country that sorely needed both.
Despite the assassination of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., despite the embarrassment of Watergate and so forth, we had within us a natural strength and courage that we could overcome any difficulty.
What Carter was selling in '76 was that I'm an outsider, that I wasn't part of the dramatic events of the '60s.
He said his name was Jimmy Carter, and he was running for president.
Carter ran his campaign out of an old train depot in his hometown of Plains, Georgia. The imagery was hokey and homespun, and it worked. Number 39, Jimmy Carter, Democrat, 1977 to 1981, 52 years old, from Georgia.
Will you place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right hand and repeat after me?
From the start, Jimmy Carter wanted to be a different kind of president. After taking the oath of office, he walked the inaugural parade route from the Capitol to the White House, just as Thomas Jefferson had done in 1801.
It was a wonderful political gesture at the inauguration because it demonstrated what the president should always demonstrate, and that's humility.
Carter's family was always a visible part of his presidency. Daughter Amy had her own treehouse on the White House grounds, and hard-drinking brother Billy made headlines pitching Billy beer. Jimmy Carter enjoyed softball and jogging. He was a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and served in the pioneering nuclear submarine program. He was tenacious, virtuous, and smart. Raised a Southern Baptist, he was a deeply religious man whose Secret Service code name was Deacon.
He was a man of great faith, a truly good man. He said what he felt. I think he tried to do what was right by his standards, his Christian standards, in every instance. That doesn't always work in this city.
Carter was seen in Washington as something of a weirdo because people in Washington were not used to presidents with deeply sincere religious beliefs.
We're going to meet our goal to cut that down 21%.
Carter approached the job of president with the same Protestant work ethic that had served him well throughout his life. He micromanaged the White House agenda, spending long hours scouring over briefing books and memos.
Jimmy Carter digested memos like the rest of us do hot dogs or something. He scooped them up and he ate them.
For President Carter, the Oval Office would prove to be a crucible where high ideals were challenged and often withered under the heat of political realities. He found the political games of Washington unsavory, and he mostly refused to play them.
You've got to get along with those politicians. You got to get along with that House. You got to get along with that Senate. And he just didn't do it. He would not play that game.
I thought that Jimmy Carter was someone who was very idealistic, wanted to do the right thing, but I felt like he never had the kind of pragmatic political sense that you need in order to negotiate the power centers that you have to negotiate in Washington if you're going to get anything done.
Carter's political reticence handicapped his domestic initiatives, although he did change the face of the presidential cabinet, adding posts for energy and education. It was on the world scene where he truly made his mark. He will go down in history as the president who made human rights central to his foreign policy.
In the past, we had gone to bed with the military dictatorships all over South America, Latin America, and Central America, and so forth. I decided that we should reverse that policy.
Without taking away anything from President Carter's real diplomatic achievements, the flip side of that coin is a certain naivete about the world. Brutal, harsh, menacing.
In his best moments, Carter's combination of religious idealism with a tenacity of purpose yielded spectacular results. None was more important than the 1978 Camp David Accords, which Carter personally brokered between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Carter took on the role as peacemaker in the Middle East despite strong skepticism from his advisors and the American press.
And all those intelligent reporters and press people said, "Oh, come on, it's not going to work, Mr. President. It's, not a good idea, et cetera, et cetera." And Carter proved to be right, and we, as usual, proved to be wrong.
Surely Carter enjoyed defying the Washington establishment, but he had a higher purpose in bringing Sadat and Begin to the bargaining table.
I've been a Bible teacher since I was 18 years old. I taught Bible lessons at the Naval Academy Chapel when I was a midshipman at Annapolis. I knew the geography of the Holy Land. I knew the ancient histories and the challenges and so forth. So I had an idealistic ambition of seeing if I couldn't bring peace between Israel primarily and Egypt and address simultaneously the problems of the Palestinians.
Getting Sadat and Begin to sit down with each other was an achievement in itself, but getting them to agree on anything was a challenge of almost biblical proportions.
I found that Begin and Sadat were personally incompatible. The first 3 days, all they did was argue about ancient grievances and made ugly remarks at each other.
There's this extraordinary moment when Begin blows up and wants to march out of the cabin and leave Maryland, and Carter puts his hands and blocks him and says, "You're not going. I'm not letting you guys leave until we get a peace accord."
It took 13 days, but finally, an exhausted President Carter persuaded Sadat and Begin to agree on a framework for peace. The signing of the Camp David Accords was the high water mark of the Carter years. Within months of that achievement, an energy and economic crisis that had been building throughout the 1970s sent Carter's approval ratings plummeting.
Does Jimmy Carter deserve the blame for the stagnant economy? Of course not. But did he do anything to exude consumer confidence? No.
There was a perception that this was a good and decent man who was in over his head.
The summer of 1979 gave birth to one of the lasting images of the Carter years, Americans waiting in long lines for gasoline. The crucible was beginning to overheat.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
The president intended this 1979 Oval Office address to be a national pep talk, but opponents famously dubbed it Carter's malaise speech.
Everything he was saying was very true. But American people don't want to be scolded, and if something's going wrong, they don't want to be told they're the cause of it. We hire a president to fix our problems, not to whine about them.
As if the economic mess wasn't enough of a cross to bear, Carter was yet to face the most difficult challenge of his presidency. In October of 1979, Islamic militants stormed the American embassy in Iran, keeping 52 Americans as hostages.
The taking of the hostages was an enormous shock to the country. To see the American diplomats paraded with blindfolds and all kinds of humiliation was a shock to the American people.
Carter resisted calls for a swift military response, preferring the slow path of diplomacy. It was a decision that reawakened the uneasy feeling among many Americans that he was too weak-kneed to be president. But Carter wasn't about to start dropping bombs just to boost his poll numbers.
My most difficult decision was not using military force against Iran. I could have destroyed Iran, all its oil fields and so forth, with a military attack. But I thought that in that process, our lives would be endangered or maybe lost. My goal from the very beginning was to bring back every single hostage safe and free.
A failed military rescue effort in April 1980 further weakened Carter's image. The 1980 election was held on the one-year anniversary of the taking of the hostages. Amid the avalanche of bad news, Carter lost in a landslide to an optimistic and tough-talking former actor from California, Ronald Reagan. Carter became obsessed with securing the release of the hostages before his term expired and spent the last sleepless days of his presidency conducting negotiations from the Oval Office. But on the morning of Reagan's inauguration, 52 American hostages were still in captivity.
We are a nation that has
It wasn't until Reagan was delivering his inaugural address that Carter was informed on the reviewing stand that the hostages had boarded airplanes and were preparing at last to leave Iran.
They had been sitting in an airplane at the end of the Tehran airport for about 2 hours and a half before that time, just waiting, I think, according to the Ayatollah Khomeini, until I was no longer president.
Some speculate that the hostage release was delayed intentionally to hinder Carter's re-election bid. But all President Carter cared about was that after 444 days in captivity, 52 American citizens were coming home unharmed.
I was euphoric with joy and thanksgiving, and thank God for answering my 14 months of prayers. I don't think I have ever had a more happy and joyous moment in my life than to know that finally the hostages were coming home.
Carter returned home to Georgia, where he embarked upon a post-presidential career as a peacemaker and international statesman, which earned him a Nobel Prize and universal acclaim as a model ex-president. In many ways, the successes of his later life were forged in the crucible of his difficult presidency.
I think the main thing I learned was that you have to work with others, and you have to have dreams of greatness, and sometimes you can't be completely successful, but that you ought not to let the possibility or even the prospects of disappointment deter you in setting the highest possible standards of morality and ethics and honesty and decency and peace.
Jimmy Carter is distantly related to Elvis Presley and June Carter Cash.
All right, quiet on the set.
In 1980, former movie actor Ronald Reagan swept his way to the presidency, beating incumbent Jimmy Carter in 44 states. Coming on the heels of the bad news-laden Carter administration, Reagan's flag-draped conservative rhetoric had a strong popular appeal.
Ronald Reagan was indeed that patriotic, did indeed have that view of America as something out of a 1930s movie.
Number 40, Ronald Reagan, Republican, 1981 to 1989, 69 years old, from California. So far, Ronald Reagan is the oldest president ever to be elected, and even to those who served on his staff, he's one of the most unlikely.
I always assumed that the brightest person made the best leader. And Reagan was not the brightest person in the country, but he was a terrific leader.
Reagan enjoyed his time in the Oval Office, whether feeding the White House squirrels or sharing a weekly Mexican lunch with Vice President George Bush. Reagan's First Lady, Nancy, had great influence over him, sometimes planning his appointments based on advice from her astrologer. President Reagan had few close friends, but he was well-liked in Washington.
He was the life of the party. And the person he was likely to enjoy most would be the one with the most new dirty jokes.
The nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. I'm speaking to you tonight.
Known as the great communicator, Reagan knew how to strike just the right chord in times of crisis.
Nuclear destruction.
The defining Reagan moment for me is the Challenger disaster.
Challenger, go with throttle.
Ronald Reagan exhibited that quality that I call the chief soother.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
Even when he faced down the bullet of a would-be assassin, Reagan projected a calm that reassured the country.
When I saw all those doctors around me, too, I said, I hope they were all Republicans.
It was that humor when he was shot that I think endeared people to Reagan and also gave them a sense This is a strong, tough fellow. I think it was the transforming moment in his presidency.
Ronald Reagan's management style reflected his Hollywood training. He was the star, and it was up to the rest of the crew to keep the production running smoothly. This led to the perception that he was a puppet.
He was certainly not a puppet. He made all the decisions. He could be disengaged from the details of policy.
Reagan was also rumored to fall asleep in cabinet meetings.
The suggestion that he went to sleep in cabinet meetings is ludicrous. I've got a wonderful doodle out here that he did that says, "Dear Jim, you see, I don't sleep in all the cabinet meetings. Sometimes I do this." And so he was able to poke fun at himself.
But Reagan's lax management style may have led to the darkest episode of his presidency, the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan denied knowledge of the illegal scheme that funded anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua with proceeds from covert arms sales to Iran. With most presidents, such a claim would seem far-fetched. But in Reagan's case, it was entirely plausible that he was out of the loop.
There were a lot of people at that time, particularly in the National Security Council, who were going around, running around doing things that I'm quite confident the president didn't know about.
In the end, Reagan avoided criminal charges in the Iran-Contra affair, although he did accept responsibility. Sort of.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
While he was forced to backpedal on Iran-Contra, Reagan never wavered from his core beliefs.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Reagan had an almost religious devotion to shrinking the size of government, building up the military, and lowering taxes. His economic plan led to a boom in the 80s and record deficits in the 90s.
Reaganomics is built on the theory that you don't have to worry about the future. You can cut taxes, you can raise spending, you can raise defense spending, and ultimately you don't have to worry.
Of course, you've got huge deficits, but Reagan was doing this philosophically. He wasn't doing this as an economist.
Enough Americans believed in the rightness of Reagan's policies that he was re-elected overwhelmingly in 1984. In his campaign that year, he trumpeted the return of domestic prosperity, declaring it was morning in America.
It was a lot of rhetoric. It's the notion that you wave the flag and celebrate American virtues and turn a blind eye to failings.
Overlooked in Reagan's rosy view of America were issues like AIDS, women's rights, and homelessness.
It's understandable with Reagan because he doesn't believe in using government for social engineering.
But the cornerstone of Reagan's legacy, and any claim he might have on presidential greatness, is the notion that his leadership won the Cold War for America.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
The struggle to contain and then stop the spread of Soviet communism begins, of course, with Harry Truman and goes through all of the presidents. But what Ronald Reagan does is he makes it into a moral thing. He says, this is an evil empire. It's going to collapse.
Communism is another sad, bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages even now are being written.
Using his strong rhetoric as political cover, Reagan was able to take a softer approach with his Soviet counterpart when the opportunity presented itself.
Reagan, to his credit, sees that in Gorbachev, he has someone he can negotiate with. And Reagan seizes upon that. They have 4 summit conferences, summit meetings, and this does move the Soviet Union along the road toward the collapse, which occurs in 1989, 1990.
When Reagan went to Geneva for the first of his summits with Gorbachev, aides were worried that the president would be overmatched by the more detail-oriented Soviet leader. Gorbachev, a former engineer, was reputed to be a master of the intricacies of geopolitics and weapon systems.
But they became fast friends. They met in Geneva, 4 hours of talks. And I finally got nerve up to ask Reagan one time at a little private dinner. I said, you weren't a detail man. I said, how'd this happen? I remember Reagan looked at me and said, oh, Hugh, he said, he didn't know any of that stuff either.
In 1983, Reagan unveiled what was to be one of the most bizarre presidential initiatives of all time.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
The Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, was largely a product of Reagan's own imagination.
It would stop missiles in outer space so they couldn't hit our house.
Well, I have to tell you, SDI, the so-called Star Wars initiative, was a shock to most of us on the White House staff. We never saw it coming. And it was Reagan being Reagan. It was something he wanted to do, and he didn't want to staff it out.
Although dismissed by most as impractical, it now appears that the Soviets took SDI seriously. Suffering from internal economic problems, Gorbachev knew he couldn't keep up with an arms race in space.
Whatever one thinks about the military merits of it, I think it was a masterstroke diplomatically. It was at that point that the Soviets came to the realization, we can't compete with this. We can't keep up in the arms race. And I think that SDI, in retrospect, hastened the end of the Cold War.
During a 1987 visit to the divided city of Berlin, Reagan put an exclamation point on his rhetorical war against Soviet communism.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I thought it was a joke. I never expected that this daring statement, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, would have any effect. It was just simply rhetoric, words playing to the audience. But then it happened.
By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Ronald Reagan had retired to California. His supporters give Reagan credit for causing both the collapse of the wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union itself a year later.
This idea that Reagan won the Cold War is terribly overblown.
It was Reagan's luck to be in the right place at the right time.
I think the Cold War was won by a succession of Republican and Democratic presidents over a period of 40 years who were willing to stay the course against the expansionist aims of the Soviet Union.
When Ronald Reagan died in June of 2004, he was eulogized as one of the greatest presidents of all time, and some wondered if there was room for one more face on Mount Rushmore. Only time will tell if Reagan joins that elite pantheon. What is clear is that Reagan was a substantial figure in American presidential history, a key player in ending the Cold War, revitalizing the conservative movement, and assuring America that it was still okay to wave the red, white, and blue. Though Ronald Reagan was the epitome of a conservative Republican, his personal role model for the presidency was Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
The way to do the president is to start out with Mr. Rogers. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Then you add a little John Wayne. Here we go. Let's go over the ridge. You put them together. You got George Herbert Walker Bush.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
In 1989, George Bush became the first sitting vice president to win a presidential election since Martin Van Buren in 1836. Bush helped secure his victory with a bold campaign pledge.
Read my lips. No new taxes. And we've got to hold that line.
What was important at that point in time was to sound decisive. It could have been read my lips, I will stand up to the Soviet Union, or read my lips, I will shop at Walmart. It really didn't matter. It was decisive.
Number 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, 1989 to 1993, 64 years old, from Texas. George Bush's resume was long and distinguished. He had been a two-term congressman from Texas, a UN ambassador, and was the first president to have been head of the CIA. Bush was a New Englander by birth, but spent much of his adult life in Texas. He was a Yale man known for loyalty to his friends and a competitive streak that carried over from sports into politics.
Oh, get in.
Bush's opponents seized upon his preppy image and characterized him as a wimp.
You know, the wimp factor really isn't fair, because this is a man who is a World War II hero, who got blown out of his airplane, almost died serving his country. George Bush is many things. A wimp is simply not one of them.
With his management style, Bush set out to show that he was more engaged than his predecessor, Ronald Reagan.
Bush drove everybody crazy trying to keep up with him in the White House.
He was basically a very nice guy and very much a centrist in a way. He really liked to govern the country, based on consensus.
Bush's presidency was defined by two major foreign policy events, the end of the Cold War and the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. In both instances, he displayed his deftness for patient diplomacy. But as the free world cheered the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, President Bush was actually criticized for playing it cool.
You don't seem elated, and I'm wondering if you're thinking of the problem.
I'm just not an emotional kind of guy.
Well, how elated are you?
I'm very pleased.
There was one politician who said that if it was me in the White House, I'd be dancing on top of the Berlin Wall. I'm glad he wasn't. Bush instinctively knew that for bigger and better things, he was going to need Gorbachev's partnership.
The way to do that was not to stick it in their eye when the Berlin Wall came down, but to continue to work with them so the Cold War would end with a whimper and not with a bang, and that's what President Bush did.
The most difficult test of Bush's presidential leadership began in August of 1990, when Iraqi strongman Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait.
Unfortunately, Iraq has thus far turned a deaf ear to the voices of peace and reason.
In his public speeches, Bush emphasized the need to respond to the naked aggression of Saddam Hussein, but he had other reasons for taking the country to war.
Look, I've been a member of 4 administrations. In every one of those administrations, we had as a written national security policy that we would go to war to protect the energy reserves of the Persian Gulf, if necessary, to protect access to those energy reserves for the West. Well, it was necessary in 1991, and we did it.
In the months leading up to the Gulf War, George Bush worked the phones, enlisting the support of the United Nations and building an international coalition of 34 countries to eject Saddam from Kuwait.
I think that the elder George Bush was the best foreign policy president we've had in my lifetime. He realized it would be wrong and counterproductive for America to try to do the invasion and be responsible for its aftermath without the support not only of our European allies, but of Arab nations in the region. And it was that type of foreign policy, that ability to be an internationalist and to care about other nations and allies, that really set the elder George Bush apart.
We are not here on some exercise. This is a real-world situation. And we're not walking away until our mission is done, until the invader is out of Kuwait.
After 5.5 weeks of aerial bombardment, the ground war began. Within hours, the Iraqi army was in full retreat from Kuwait, and soldiers were surrendering en masse. Bush now had an opportunity to send troops into Baghdad to topple Saddam's regime, but instead he declared it was mission accomplished. Leaving Saddam in power was a controversial decision, but one about which Bush had no doubts.
Taking Saddam out of power was never one of George Bush's stated war aims. The stated war aim was getting him out of Kuwait.
We tried to get him, of course, during the war, because he was the leader of the Iraqi armed forces. That would have been perfectly legitimate. To get him after the war, we would have had to occupy Iraq, go all the way to Baghdad, and we see today that was not a particularly attractive choice.
After the war, Bush's approval rating soared to 84%. Re-election in 1992 seemed likely. But the deficit spawned by the Reagan years had forced the president to renege on his famous campaign pledge and agree to raise taxes.
Bush betrayed our trust. He raised our taxes.
It may have cost him the election, but it was probably good for the country.
I think one of the great things George Bush did is to go back on that pledge and to make the compromises necessary with the Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill to get us a little bit closer to the path of a balanced budget. That worked, and that helped set the stage for the great economic growth of the 1990s.
Unseated by the charismatic Bill Clinton, President Bush left behind a legacy of political moderation. In the end, he proved to be an able, behind-the-scenes operator and skilled diplomat, but an inadequate salesman of his ideas and policies. In 1974, George Bush, as chairman of the Republican National Committee, formally asked Richard Nixon to resign.
They have had the White House so long that they've run out of energy, run out of ideas, run out of direction, and they ought to be run out of town, and with your help we can.
Bill Clinton was the first rock and roll president. The saxophone-playing governor from Arkansas had run a youthful campaign. He revealed on MTV what type of underwear he favored while outrunning whispered allegations of extramarital affairs.
I was Bill Clinton's lover for 12 years.
There is a school of thought that Bill Clinton really wanted to be a rock star, but he'd settle for being president of the States if he could live like a rock star.
Number 42, Bill Clinton, Democrat, 1993 to 2001, 46 years old, from Arkansas. Bill Clinton's election fulfilled a lifelong ambition for a poor kid from the wrong side of the tracks who was determined to become president. As a politician, he was a natural.
Clinton was the most seductive and charming person I've ever seen in national politics. He could be in a room of 100 people and make each person he talked to feel like he was directly boring into that person's soul.
He's famous for his handshake. It's not just a handshake. He grabs your hand and then his other hand moves up your arm, and pretty soon he's enfolded you in a giant embrace. He was just kind of all-embracing bear of a man.
Clinton was a Yale Law School graduate and a Rhodes Scholar. His empathy, captured in the catchphrase, "I feel your pain," was legendary. So was his appetite for junk food.
How is that?
I ain't eating it yet. I'm eating the apple fritter right now.
Bill Clinton's management style was chaotic. His White House was known for casual dress, crowded meetings, and all-night bull sessions.
He is so interested in different viewpoints that he could have 60 people in a room and be willing to listen to every one of them because he might just find a different clue as to something he hadn't thought about.
One viewpoint Clinton clearly valued was his first ladies. Hillary Clinton was the first presidential spouse to have an office in the West Wing. And to some members of the staff, it seemed like there were two presidents.
You could take an issue to the president, and if he said no, you could appeal to the First Lady, and maybe she would say yes, and then maybe you could get her to get him to change his mind.
Neither are those people.
Clinton's first 2 years in office saw the failure of the administration's health care reform initiative and the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Thanks in part to the vehemence of Clinton's political enemies, the young presidency was already being defined by the types of investigations and scandals that would eventually consume it. Travelgate, Whitewater, and the filing of a sexual harassment lawsuit against the president by Paula Jones. In the 1994 midterm elections, a resurgent Republican Party gained control of both houses of Congress for the first time in 40 years.
He was clearly depressed by the loss that had taken place.
Everybody figured he was finished. They underestimated what a good politician Bill Clinton is.
Clinton made a move towards the political center, using public opinion polls as his guidepost. But he was challenged at every step by his newly minted nemesis, Republican Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich.
In some ways, Newt Gingrich was a great gift to Bill Clinton, much as the malefactors of great wealth were to Teddy Roosevelt or Douglas MacArthur was to Harry Truman.
It was in the budget negotiations late in 1995 that the battle between Clinton and Gingrich came to a head. With the threat of a government shutdown looming, Gingrich tried to force Clinton into making concessions on Medicare and education spending. But the president refused to compromise.
At that point, I said to myself, the president gets it, because in politics, you really do have to draw a line. And at that point, he understood that he had to draw a line. And I think it was a turning point in the presidency.
Clinton's risk paid off. He was able to paint Gingrich and the Republicans as the cause of the government shutdown, forcing them to an eventual budget compromise. It was a great political victory. But during the shutdown, most of the paid White House staff was sent home, which allowed an unpaid intern named Monica Lewinsky to get unusually close to the president. With his convincing re-election in 1996, Clinton's political comeback was complete. Taking advantage of the booming American economy, he was now able to steer Congress to balance the federal budget for the first time since Andrew Jackson's presidency. Then the bubble burst. In August 1998, Clinton's Oval Office affair with Monica Lewinsky became public when the former intern was called to testify in the Paula Jones sexual harassment case.
That was the beginning of Lewinsky Gate and the scandal that just totally consumed Bill Clinton's presidency.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
When you make a mistake, you got to fess up and do it fast. If he had said, I made a mistake with this young woman, I'm sorry, it would have been controversial, been hard. But I think the country would have rallied to him and we could have been spared the impeachment process.
Instead, on December 19, 1998, Bill Clinton became only the second president in history to be impeached. As had happened with Andrew Johnson 130 years earlier, the momentum of the impeachment process sputtered when it came time to vote him out of office. Neither the American public nor the United States Senate found Clinton's lying about his sex life to be an adequate reason for his removal.
I think 100 years from now, historians are still going to be scratching their heads on the question of the impeachment of Bill Clinton. Was it an impeachable offense? Well, it was impeachable only because it was caught up in this strange and bitter politics that really defined the 1990s.
It was a dangerous sideshow because while we were all concentrating on Bill Clinton's sexual peccadillos, Osama bin Laden in the mountains of Afghanistan was preparing a plot that was going to kill 3,000 Americans.
Having survived impeachment, Clinton did what he could to salvage the remainder of his presidency. He lent American military might to a NATO effort that halted an ethnic cleansing campaign in Kosovo. And he made a bold but unsuccessful effort to revive the faltering peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. By the time he left office, Bill Clinton had presided over the longest economic expansion in American history, yet his legacy will always be clouded by his impeachment.
You're not going to have kids queuing up in Little Rock at his presidential library to see the NAFTA pen under glass. People look for drama in history, and the great drama of the Clinton years, unfortunately, was his impeachment problem and the Lewinsky scandal, and that's what he has to live with.
During the 1994 baseball strike, President Bill Clinton ordered representatives of the players and owners to meet and resolve the strike. Both sides ignored the presidential order. The 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush seemed like it would never end. Gore won the popular vote, but neither candidate could claim victory in the Electoral College until it was determined who rightfully won the close race in Florida. Simply put, whoever won the state's 25 disputed electoral votes would win the presidency. What followed was a circus of recounts and court cases. The affair was settled more than a month after Election Day with a seemingly partisan 5-4 Supreme Court decision that halted the recounts and handed the election to Bush. For the son of the 41st president, it was time to unify the country.
I think the expectation, at least in the press, was that because Bush had won so narrowly, he would be a fairly moderate figure. People like me who guessed that guessed wrong.
Number 43, George W. Bush, Republican, first elected in 2000, 53 years old, from Texas. When he was elected, George W. Bush joined John Quincy Adams as the only presidential son to win the White House. The younger George Bush was more conservative than his father, but shared some similarities in his worldview.
Both Bushes see the world in good guy, bad guy mentality. Both Bushes see Saddam Hussein as evil. Both Bushes see the forces of the United States as the good force. And both Bushes have taken policy steps to ensure that good would triumph over evil. It's a part of their makeup.
George W. Bush was a former prep school cheerleader who embraced the cowboy ethic of his Texas home. As a leader, he sometimes came across as the national sheriff.
And so long as I'm the president of this country, we're going to chase them down one by one to make sure the American homeland is secure.
A graduate of Yale and Harvard Business School and the former governor of Texas, Bush nevertheless portrayed himself as an outsider who disdained the elites. His inarticulate speaking style led many to question his intelligence.
A report came out of the atomic, the IAEA, that they were 6 months away from developing a weapon.
His intelligence is an emotional intelligence. He can look at people, he can size them up pretty quickly, he can get to the heart of what they're like, and tend to know how to judge them. That's a pretty useful attribute in a politician and a useful one in the president. It would be nice if it were combined with some depth of reflection and some nuance and some curiosity, and intellectual curiosity and rigor about the issues.
Despite his lack of curiosity for the details, Bush is one of the most decisive presidents in history, and he runs a tight ship.
In the Clinton White House, everything ran late, including the president. In the Bush White House, everything is on time, and it's considered to be rude and unacceptable if you're late for a meeting. You come dressed in your suit, you make it brief, you salute the commander-in-chief, and then you go. It's a very rigorous, orderly process.
Bush may very well have enjoyed a leisurely presidency if not for the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
This president's had 2 inaugurations. I mean, he had a formal constitutional inauguration, and then 3 days after September 11th, he had his real inauguration.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done.
What Bush was really code wording to the American people is revenge. We're going to get who did this to us.
With the overwhelming support of the American public, Bush launched a military campaign that rid Afghanistan of the terrorist-harboring Taliban government. At the same time, he centralized domestic security under a new federal bureaucracy, the Department of Homeland Security.
He came to Washington, sworn to making government less central to our lives. And yet, because of events that no one could have foreseen, he has presided over, arguably, the greatest centralization of authority in Washington, perhaps since Lyndon Johnson.
In his 2002 State of the Union address, Bush seemed to widen the scope of his war on terror to include regimes in North Korea, Iran, and Iraq.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
We know now that this expression, the axis of evil, grew partly as cover. Bush wanted to signal that he wanted to go after Iraq, but he didn't want to be too obvious about it.
After a failed attempt to win international support for overthrowing Saddam Hussein, Bush used his new doctrine of preemption to launch a unilateral war in Iraq.
I think Bush made the decision to invade Iraq far too early. He tried to tie it in with the global spread of terrorism, and the ties were very tenuous. He had a group of advisors around him and certain things in his own mind and heart that said that Iraq was the next place we had to fight.
In 2004, George W. Bush avoided the fate of his father when he was re-elected to a second term. It's still too soon for historians to assess his presidency.
We do know this, though, that it is an important presidency. And that's more than we know about many presidencies.
The walls of the White House bear witness to the storied history of the American presidency. Men from all parts of the country and all walks of life, each took on the office with high hopes and pledged to lead the country to the best of his ability.